The evening sun was sinking behind the ridges, spilling a copper glow over the lonely Arizona plains. Wind rolled softly through the tall grass, bending it in waves that whispered secrets of the desert. Out there, miles from any town or wagon trail, a lone rider was heading home, dust on his boots, sweat on his brow, and the heavy quiet of the frontier pressing on his mind. The ranch sat low between two hills, a modest spread of fences and corrals built with calloused hands and long days. It wasn't much, but it was his. He had worked the land for years, and in that time, he'd learned two things. Nature was never merciful, and a man survived only by his grit and conscience. He was riding slow that evening, letting his horse find its way along the narrow creek bed that ran past the southern fence line. The day had been long, fixing fences torn down by wild mustangs and mending the well pump again. But there was peace in the rhythm of it, the clink of spurs, the smell of sage, the hum of cicadas rising with the dusk. Then, out of nowhere, the horse pricked its ears and snorted. Something had changed in the air. The rider reined in and listened. There was a faint rustle in the brush just beyond the creek. A sound too heavy for a rabbit or bird. He dismounted, hand on the rifle strap to the saddle. "Easy now," he murmured to the horse, then stepped through the grass toward the sound. What he saw made him stop cold. A woman lay partly in the water, her dress soaked and torn, her dark hair tangled with mud and reeds. Her skin glistened pale under the fading light, and her breath came in shallow gasps. The first thought that struck him was that she might be dead. But when he crouched down, she opened her eyes. They were sharp and wary, the deep brown of desert earth after rain. She tried to move, but winced, and fell back with a trembling hand pressed to her thigh. He didn't recognize her from any of the nearby settlements. Her clothes were simple woven fabric with small beads and a leather cord at the neck. She wasn't from town. She was Apache, one of the people who lived deep in the hills, far from the white man's ranches and fences. That realization made him tense for a moment, but the sight of her pain overruled it. "You're hurt," he said quietly. She didn't answer, just looked at him with eyes that seemed to judge his every motion. He could see the mark on her leg, now two red punctures surrounded by swelling skin. It was a snake bite. From the look of it, a rattler had struck her hard, and the poison was already spreading. He looked around, trying to find her horse or any trace of how she got there, but the area was empty. Only her footprints showed in the mud, trailing from the ridge above. "You're lucky I came this way," he said, but she only shook her head faintly, whispering something in her own tongue. He couldn't understand it, yet the fear in her voice was clear. He knew the bite was bad, too high for her to reach herself, too deep for time to wait. If he didn't act, she wouldn't last an hour. The desert fell completely silent around them. Even the wind seemed to stop. The man hesitated, torn between what was right and what was proper. Helping her meant crossing a line most ranchers never would. But walking away meant letting her die alone in the dirt. He set his rifle aside and tore a strip of cloth from his shirt, tying it just above the bite to slow the poison. She flinched but didn't fight him. Her skin was burning hot, her breath quick and uneven. "Don't move," he said softly. "I'll get you out of this." She watched him the whole time, her gaze full of pride even in weakness. As though she refused to beg for help, he carried her to his horse. Feeling the weight of both her body and the decision he had made. The nearest doctor was in town, 20 miles off, and the sun was nearly gone. The only chance was his ranch, a small cabin, a few supplies, and his own two hands. He mounted carefully with her in his arms, her head resting against his shoulder. Her heartbeat was faint against his chest. The horse started forward, hooves thudding against the dry ground as the first stars appeared in the sky. By the time they reached the cabin, the moon had risen high. Coyotes were howling in the distance, and the desert air had turned cold. He carried her inside, laying her gently on a cot near the fire. She was barely conscious now, murmuring words he couldn't make out. He lit a lamp, its glow flickering across the wooden walls. The wound looked worse under the light, the flesh swollen, angry red veins running outward like cracks in glass. He grabbed what little he had, a knife, whiskey, and a strip of clean cloth. "This is gonna hurt," he said quietly, though she couldn't hear him anymore. He worked fast but careful, doing what he'd seen old trail hands do when a man got bit. The sound of his own heartbeat filled his ears as he tried to draw out the poison. When it was done, sweat rolled down his back, and the room smelled of smoke and blood. She stirred faintly, her hand gripping the edge of the blanket. He poured a small cup of water and held it to her lips. "Drink," he said. She obeyed weakly. Then, with her eyes half open, she looked at him for the first time without fear. Something passed between them, a silent understanding that went deeper than words. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. He sat back in the chair by the fire, watching her breathe. The night was long, and he knew the danger wasn't over. Snake venom had a way of creeping through the body, slow and merciless, and he'd done all he could. Now it was up to her strength to fight it. He didn't know who she was, where she came from, or what had driven her across his land. But something told him her story wasn't a simple one. There was a reason she'd been out there alone, a reason that might bring trouble to his quiet life before dawn. As the hours passed, he found himself listening to every sound outside, the howl of the wind, the creak of the roof, the whisper of the desert. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was searching for her. Once, he thought he saw a shadow move near the corral, but when he stepped outside with the rifle, there was nothing. Only moonlight and silence. When he returned, she was awake again, eyes wide and filled with confusion. She tried to sit up, but the pain forced her back. "Rest," he said firmly. She turned her head, her gaze landing on the rifle by the door, then back at him. There was a question in her eyes, a mix of fear and trust. He didn't speak, only adjusted the blanket and added another log to the fire. She whispered a single word, one he couldn't understand, but the tone carried something soft, almost grateful. He nodded, not sure what else to do. The fire crackled, throwing shadows on the walls. For a moment, it felt like they were the only two souls left in the world, bound by danger, silence, and the uncertain mercy of the desert night. When the wind outside shifted again, he noticed the faint sound of hoofbeats far off, slow, steady, and closing in. His hand went instinctively to the rifle. Whoever was coming, they were riding through the night toward his ranch. He looked back at the woman, her face pale but calm now, as if she already knew who it was. And as the distant rhythm of horses grew louder, the man realized this night was far from over. The hoofbeats grew clearer through the still night air. Each thud echoed off the valley walls like a slow drum, steady and deliberate. The rancher stood by the window, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the corral. The lamp flickered behind him, throwing his shadow long across the wall. The woman lay still on the cot, her breathing uneven, her gaze fixed on the door as if she already knew what danger was riding. Toward them, he tightened his grip on the rifle and waited. It wasn't long before he saw them, 3 riders cresting the ridge. Dark shapes against the silver light of the moon. They rode without hurry, but their direction was sure, straight toward the cabin. He could see the glint of metal, the glimmer of a lantern swinging from one saddle horn. Whoever they were, they didn't belong to any of the nearby ranches, and they weren't coming by chance. He turned back toward the woman. Her lips moved faintly, whispering a word he couldn't understand. He knelt beside her, trying to catch it again. "Who are they?" he asked. She swallowed hard and tried to speak, but her voice broke, coming out in a rasp. "Men. From the hills," she managed to say, her accent thick, her eyes filled with fear. "They find me. They kill me." He didn't ask why. There was no time. He went to the door, bolted it shut, and moved to douse the lamp. The cabin sank into dim firelight, shadows trembling on the log walls. The riders stopped just outside the fence, voices low but sharp in the cold air. He could hear them talking in a mix of English and Apache, their tones harsh and impatient. The sound carried easily in the stillness. "Someone's been here," one voice said. "Tracks lead right to the cabin," another replied. "If she's inside, we take her, dead or alive." Now the rancher's jaw tightened. He had no reason to protect her except that she was helpless and half dead in his care. But that was enough. He'd lived long enough on the frontier to know what honor meant, even when it cost you. He blew out the lamp and stood near the window. Watching the faint silhouettes beyond the fence line, minutes dragged on before the riders turned their horses and rode off, circling around toward the far edge of the pasture. He knew they weren't gone. They were waiting for dawn. He sat back in the chair by the fire and reloaded his rifle. Keeping his eyes on the door, the woman stirred again, whispering something in her own tongue. He went to her side. "They'll come back," he said quietly. She nodded weakly. "They want me for what I know." He didn't push for details. Her voice trembled when she spoke, and her skin was still hot from the poison. He soaked another cloth in cool water and placed it on her forehead. "You'll rest now," he said. "We'll deal with the rest come morning." Her eyes met his for a moment, full of silent gratitude. Then she closed them, drifting into a restless sleep. He stayed awake long after the fire burned low. The night outside was heavy with tension, every sound carrying a weight of danger. The rancher's mind drifted to what might have let her hear how a young Apache woman could end up alone and bitten by a rattler on the far edge of his land. Maybe she had been running from someone, or maybe she had stumbled across the wrong territory. Whatever it was, she wasn't just lost. She was hunted by dawn. The storm of the night had faded into a cold, pale stillness. He stepped outside quietly, rifle slung across his shoulder. The desert stretched wide and empty, but near the creek, he found signs of the riders again: hoofprints, ash from a small fire, and a scrap of fabric tangled on a bush. They had camped nearby, waiting for light. He knew they'd be back soon. When he returned to the cabin, the woman was awake. Her face was pale, but her eyes clearer. She tried to sit up, wincing from the pain in her leg. "You shouldn't move," he said. "The poison's still in you." She looked at him with a tired kind of strength. "You help me," she said slowly. "You don't know me." "I don't need to," he replied. "You needed help. That's enough." She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to understand why a man like him would risk trouble. "For her, I am called Naira," she said at last. "My people lived in the high valley north of here. White men came, took our land, burned our lodges. Some of my people fought. I ran." He listened quietly as she spoke, her voice unsteady but full of memory. "The men who came last night," she went on, "they not white, not Apache. They belong to the ones who trade with both sides, guns, whiskey, money. I saw what they did. I saw them kill. They think I'd tell someone." He nodded slowly, piecing together what she meant. "So they're hunting you to keep you quiet." She looked away, her hands gripping the blanket. "They won't stop until I am gone." He thought of the riders' hard voices, the way they had spoken about taking her dead or alive. The kind of men who dealt in death for profit. He'd crossed paths with their kind before, men with no loyalty, only greed. "You can stay here for now," he said. "But if they come, we'll have to move fast." She nodded, her eyes filled with something like trust. It wasn't easy for her. He could tell she'd lived too long in a world that gave her little reason to trust anyone. Still, something in his calm steadiness seemed to ease her guard. All day, he kept busy around the cabin, mending the corral, hauling water, checking the ridge. He tried to act like everything was normal, but he could feel the tension in the air. The horses were restless. Even the wind carried a strange hush, as if the land itself was waiting for trouble. By evening, the sun dipped behind the mesa again, painting the sky in streaks of gold and violet. He brought her a small bowl of broth, and she tried to eat. "Your leg's healing," he said, glancing at the bandage. "By tomorrow, you might be able to stand." She gave a faint smile. "You good man," she said. "Why you live here alone?" He shrugged, staring into the fire. "Sometimes it's easier that way. People have their reasons to stay away from one another." "You lose someone?" she asked gently. He didn't answer right away. The flames flickered in his eyes as he said, "A long time ago. My wife and boy. Fever took them both the same winter." Naira lowered her gaze. "You carry heavy heart." "Everyone out here does," he said. "The land takes as much as it gives." The silence that followed was heavy but not uncomfortable. For the first time since finding her, He saw a faint softness in her eyes, something human beyond the fear. But before the moment could settle, a sound came again from outside. A distant creak of leather, the faint jingle of metal. He rose instantly, motioning for her to stay quiet. This time, the riders didn't bother hiding. Their silhouettes appeared against the firelight outside, moving closer to the cabin. He could see 3 of them again, same as before, and the gleam of a rifle barrel in the moonlight. He loaded his gun and positioned himself by the window. One of the men called out, "We're looking for an Apache woman. Heard she came through this way. You seen her, rancher?" He didn't answer. The man's voice carried a sneer. "Ain't smart to keep secrets. She's trouble. You don't want that kind of blood on your land." Naira's hand gripped the edge of the cot, her breath shallow. He turned slightly toward her, whispering, "Stay down." The men dismounted and stepped toward the porch, boots crunching on dry dirt. The rancher's heart pounded steady as his finger hovered near the trigger. The lead man's shadow crossed the window, his spurs glinting faintly. "Last chance," the man growled. "Hand her over." The rancher's voice was low and calm. "Ain't nobody here but me. Now turn around before I forget my manners." For a moment, there was silence. Then the man laughed coldly. "You'll regret that, cowboy." He turned back toward their horses. But the rancher knew this wasn't over. He waited until their silhouettes disappeared over the ridge again. Only then did he lower the rifle and breathe out slowly. The fire cracked softly behind him. "They'll come back," Naira said faintly. "With more men." "I know," he replied. "But I've got fences, a horse, and a clear trail north. If we leave before dawn, they won't track us easy." She stared at him, uncertain. "You help me more than my own people," she whispered. He looked at her then, really looked, and saw not just fear or weakness, but the stubborn strength of someone who had survived against impossible odds. "Maybe that's how it's supposed to be," he said quietly. Outside, the wind began to rise again, carrying dust across the plains. The night was not quiet anymore. Somewhere beyond the hills, the riders were gathering. And the rancher knew that by morning, his life would no longer belong to the calm rhythm of the land. It would be tied to hers. To danger, to a fate neither of them yet understood. Before dawn, the rancher saddled the bay mare and packed a small roll of food, bandages, and a canteen. The sky was a thin gray sheet, and the desert held its breath. He helped Naira to the horse, careful with her leg. She bit down on the pain and nodded once, determined to ride. He swung up behind her and turned the mare toward the dry wash that ran north, away from the road and any prints the outlaws might read too easily. The plan was simple: ride the wash to the high mesa, cut across Broken Rock to the Cottonwood Grove, then follow a hidden cattle trail that threaded into the foothills. Simple plans, he knew, got complicated fast. They moved slow at first. Every step jarred her leg, but she didn't complain. The soft slide of sand under hooves masked their sound, and the wind covered their scent. As the first band of light cut the horizon, he glanced back and saw only empty land behind them. He urged the mare on. In his mind, he traced the water sources and the places a man could ambush a rider. He had pushed cattle through this country for years. The land's dangers were like old neighbors, some friendly, some not. By full morning, they reached the low ridge that shielded the valley from the trading road. He paused there, watching hawks circle over a distant butte. Naira shifted carefully and pointed with her chin toward the east. "The men will ride the road," she said. "They move fast if they think I am alone." Her voice was steadier now, the poison losing its hold, though her face was still pale. He handed her the canteen, and she took a measured sip. He asked her what she had seen that night near the high valley. She looked into the pale light for a long moment before answering. "A camp where no camp should be," she said. "Barrels under canvas, a wagon with a false bottom, a map marked with our springs and your wells. They trade rifles for cattle, and cattle for coins. They want to control water and fear. If we fight them, they burn our homes. If we run, they follow the trail to the next place. I did not mean to see, but I did. One of them saw me. I ran through the rocks and fell. The snake struck. I did not think I would rise again. She touched the bandage light as a feather, then let her hand fall. They do not want the truth to travel. The rancher thought of the scarce water in this country, of windmill wells that gave life to cattle and families. If someone mapped the springs to hold them for ransom, the land would turn cruel. He had heard rumors at the trading post of a quiet ring of men who set prices with a scowl and a pistol grip. But rumors were like dust. They filled your mouth and left nothing to drink. This was different. This had weight. They took the ridge north and dropped into a basin of scrub and cholla. The mare picked delicately between thorns. Around midday, they found a seam of shade cast by stacked basalt. He helped Naira down and let the mare crop a patch of dry grass. He checked the bandage again. The swelling had eased, though the skin around the punctures looked angry. He cleaned the area and tied the cloth neat. Her eyes closed at the sting, then opened again with a stubborn glint. A sound rolled faint over the basin. Not thunder. Hoofbeats bouncing off stone. He eased Naira behind a slab and led the mare into a pocket of shadow. Two riders ghosted along the far lip of the basin, hats pulled low, rifles across their saddles. One rider lifted his head as if smelling the air. The rancher held his breath. The men kept moving, slow and sure as wolves checking a fence line. When they were gone, the rancher waited a long time, counting heartbeats. Finally, he helped Naira back to the mare, and they moved out. Skirting the wash and climbing into rough country, where tracks broke apart on rock, by late afternoon, they reached the cottonwood grove, green and soft against the gray. A trickle of water sang under a mat of leaves. He let the mare drink a little and refilled the canteen. Naira crouched by the water and washed her hands, eyes closed, as if listening to more than the stream. She said there was an old path on the north side, used in spring by deer and sometimes by her people when they crossed between valleys. It is not a white man's path, she said. They ride around, not through. They fear the rocks. He studied the trees and the way the stones pressed close like ribs of the earth. If it buys us time, we take it, he said. He'd always trusted the advice of folks who read the land better than a survey map. She moved ahead of him, light-footed, even injured, and found the notch hidden behind a fallen trunk. Beyond it, the ground rose steep and narrow, a ladder of ledges that put the basin behind them in minutes. From the top, the world looked wider and lonelier. You could see every direction except the place where your past waited. As dusk gathered, they reached a shelf of open ground. A stand of pinnon offered cover. He built a small fire no bigger than a man's hat, shielded by stones. He warmed a tin of beans and cut slices of jerky thin enough to chew. When they ate, Naira told more of the camp. The leader wore a neat vest and spoke like a banker, but his eyes were cold. He makes a book out of other men's water, she said. He knows which ranch will go dry in summer and which family will have to sell. He waits and then buys for cheap, and the men who say no find trouble at night. The rancher felt an old ache in his stomach. He'd once watched a neighbor lose a well when someone toppled a windmill in a windstorm that had no storm. Folks called it bad luck. Then a new brand took over the land 2 months later. I thought it was weather, he said. Maybe it wasn't. Naira looked into the coals. The men with the banker eyes pay riders to make bad luck. Her words hung between them, heavy as a winter sky. The rancher pictured the map she described. Springs marked like coins on a table. Wells circled in red. A wagon with a false bottom rolling along the border road. A quiet ring that set prices for the desert itself. A branch cracked in the dark. He was on his feet with the rifle in a blink. A young shape froze at the edge of the firelight, hands raised, a burlap sack over one shoulder. "Don't shoot, mister," a voice said, thin and nervous. "It's just me." The boy stepped forward, dust-streaked and skinny, hair sticking out from under a hat too big for him. He kept his eyes on the rifle and nodded toward the mare. "I seen you from the ridge. Thought you were an antelope at first, then saw the horse." The rancher lowered the rifle an inch. "You got a name?" The boy hesitated, then said, "Folks call me Finch." He glanced at Naira, then looked back quickly, surprised but not cruel. "You in trouble, mister?" "Saw 3 men ride south after noon. They turned off near the cottonwoods and started cutting back trails like hounds. I was hunting jackrabbits and didn't want to be seen, so I kept low. "What do you want, Finch?" the rancher asked. "Trade," the boy said. He lifted the sack. "Got jerky and some cartridges I found under a wagon seat at the post? I'll trade for news or coin." The rancher gave him a square of jerky and a short strip of rawhide for his busted canteen. Finch chewed with his eyes half closed like a starving pup, then talked fast. "Word at the post is a ranch north of the ridge lost a windmill last week. The owner's gone to town to talk to the banker. Also heard 2 riders asked after a woman said she stole from them." The storekeep smiled too much when he said it. "That man smiles when he lies." Naira leaned forward. "What did they say about the woman?" Finch swallowed. "Said she was dangerous. Said anyone found helping her would be sorry. Storekeep called them investors. I call them coyotes with hats." The rancher gave the boy a look of thanks and told him to keep off the trails for a few days. Finch nodded, tucked the rawhide into his belt, and slipped back into the dark like a shadow. Naira stared at the fire long after Finch was gone. If they told the post, they told the town. Soon the riders will be many. The rancher knew she was right. Once talk spread, fools would partner with devils for a handful of coins. He banked the fire to ash and they slept in turns, the wind moving through the pinin like a river of air. Before the first light, he rose and moved again, following the deer path toward the foothills. The country changed as they climbed. Rock gave way to juniper and the smell of pitch. In a narrow pass, they found an old ruin of stacked stone, weathered to nubs. "My grandmother said our people sheltered here in summer storms," Naira said softly. She set her palm on the stone and closed her eyes. The rancher looked away, giving that moment room. They crossed above a shallow canyon where a thin ribbon of water cut the rock. He saw tracks in the damp sand below. 2 riders, maybe 3, had watered their horses at dawn. One horse had a split shoe. They were close. He urged the mare on, but kept her to a walk to save her strength. The sun climbed, and the air sharpened. The kind of high country clarity that turned every sound into a warning. Near noon they reached an overlook and saw a narrow valley ahead with a weathered shack tilted near a spring. An old windmill turned lazy circles, complaining in a low groan. Smoke trickled from the chimney. The rancher hesitated. The spring was a gift and a danger. Still, the mare needed water, and Naira was pale again, fighting pain with pride. They took the slopes slow and stopped short of the shack. A woman stepped onto the porch with a kettle in one hand. She was sturdy and gray-haired, with a drawn face and hard eyes that had learned to look past nonsense. She set the kettle down and watched them without waving. "You look like trouble," she said plainly, "and I am fresh out of biscuits." The rancher kept his hands open and his voice level. "We need water and a little shade. We'll pay in work." The woman sniffed. "Work is better than talk. My name is not your business. You can call me Maud if you must." She eyed Naira and the bandage, then nodded once. "Bring her in. I keep a clean table. No blood on the floor." Inside, the shack was neat as a church. A patchwork quilt covered a short bench. Maud cleaned the wound with steady hands and a quick mouth. "Snake bite that high is a mean one. Whoever tied this did not make a fool's knot. You have some sense." She looked at the rancher when she said it, then shifted to Naira. "You got fight in you." When Naira thanked her, Maud shrugged. "The desert spins us all in the same dust. Now hush and drink this." While Naira rested, the rancher stepped outside to work on the groaning windmill. He tightened bolts and reset a warped vane. Maud joined him and spoke under the squeak of metal. "Saw 3 riders at dawn," she said. "They came for water and left with questions. I gave them answers I do not own. One of them tipped his hat like a gentleman and smiled like a grave. They will circle back. Trouble travels in loops." The rancher told her a thin version of the truth. She spat into the dust. "Men who map water and sell it back should be made to drink sand," she said. "But I am one woman, and I have this shack, and the wind does not tend itself." She nodded toward a line of low hills to the west, There's an old sheep trail in that cut. If you take it at dusk, you can reach a box canyon with caves. The riders don't know it yet. If you hide there, you buy time to decide whether you run to the border or walk into town with more proof than talk. He weighed the choices. Town meant law, but law had a way of bending when coin pressed on it. The border meant distance, but distance bends too when a map tells a man where to ride. Caves meant rest, but rest draws flies. He looked at Naira through the doorway. She was sipping Maud's bitter tea, her eyes clearer. "We take the caves," he said softly. "One night. Then we find a way to make this ring show its teeth in daylight." Maud's mouth twitched in something close to approval. "Bring the windmill oil back when you can," she said. "A woman can't keep everything tight with spit." They left at last light, after they'd stacked wood and hauled water for Maud as payment. The sheep trail wound like a thread through stone. The mare's hooves found each shallow step, and the air cooled as they slipped into the cut. Stars woke in the darkening sky. Coyotes called from far gullies. When the trail narrowed to a crack between two walls, the rancher felt the hair rise on his arms. The land was too quiet. At the mouth of the box canyon, a voice called from the shadow. "Evening ride for a pair that should have stayed home." The rancher reined up. 3 men stepped into moonlight, rifles low and sure. One wore a neat vest and a pleasant smile that never reached his eyes. He looked at Naira, then at the rancher, as if measuring weights for a scale. "You've been keeping company. I asked to be returned," he said in the smooth tone of a man used to closing deals. "Water is a scarce thing out here. So is wisdom. Hand her over, and you can ride home to your fences." The canyon's walls held the man's voice and sent it back thinner. The mare shifted under the rancher, reading his tension. Naira's fingers tightened on the saddle horn, but her chin lifted. The rancher felt the crossroads settle on his shoulders the way a yoke sits on an ox. Around them the rocks watched like old judges. He saw the map in the man's eyes. The springs turned to numbers. The wells turned to profit. The people turned to pawns. He eased his rifle up an inch, eyes fixed on the smile that did not bend. The wind moved through the cut like a slow breath. From somewhere behind the outlaws, a second set of hoofbeats echoed once, and then fell silent, as if another party waited in the dark to see how this bargain would end. The man in the vest didn't move closer. He just smiled in that cold way of his and tipped his hat, eyes glinting under the moonlight. Behind him, the other 2 riders fanned out slowly, rifles easy in their hands. The canyon walls turned their voices into echoes that sounded like ghosts whispering through stone. Naira's breath quickened, but she didn't flinch. The rancher's heart pounded slow and heavy, the way it does before a storm. He kept his rifle steady, the barrel catching a faint shimmer of moonlight. The man's tone was smooth but edged with poison. "You've got something that doesn't belong to you," he said. "That woman's been stirring talk where talk can't be afforded. I'm offering you one chance to make it right. Hand her over, take your horse, and ride home before the sun rises." The rancher didn't answer. He'd heard that tone before, the kind that came from men who'd traded their souls for land and gold. He had seen the same calm expression on faces that shot cattle to claim a range, or burned out cabins for the water rights underneath them. He knew there was no deal here, no bargain that didn't end with a grave. "You're trespassing," he said quietly. "And you're standing between me and my way out of here?" The man in the vest laughed low. "You think the land is yours, rancher? You think those fences mean something? We own the maps, the banks, the law. You just mend the wire until we say otherwise." The rancher's finger brushed the trigger, but he waited. He needed them closer, needed a moment of sure ground. The mare's muscles tightened beneath him, sensing the danger. He felt Naira's hand touch his arm, light as breath. "They will not stop," she whispered. "Even if you kill them, more will come." "I know," he said softly, "but we'll make them remember the first 3. The man in the vest stepped forward, boots scraping stone. The sound of metal on rock echoed down the canyon, sharp and cold. Behind him, one of the riders shifted his rifle, and that small motion broke the waiting stillness. The rancher fired. The shot cracked through the night like lightning tearing the sky. One man went down hard, his rifle clattering on stone. The mare reared, screaming against the echo. Another shot rang out from the outlaws, splintering a rock inches from the rancher's shoulder. He swung the horse toward the canyon wall, pulling Naira close. "Hold on," he said. They charged up the narrow slope, the mare scrambling for grip. Bullets hissed past, pinging off rock. Dust filled the air, choking and thick. The vested man shouted something, but his words were lost to the chaos. When they reached the ridge, the rancher turned the horse along the shadowed wall. He knew this part of the land, knew the gullies that twisted through the rock-like veins. Behind them, gunfire echoed, but it was fading. The sound of hoofbeats followed for a while, then fell away into silence. They rode hard until the moon sank low. The air turned cold, biting at their faces. When the mare began to stumble, he slowed and led her on foot into a ravine overgrown with mesquite. The darkness swallowed them, and for a time, there was only the whisper of wind and the throb of their breathing. He tied the horse under a ledge and crouched beside Naira. She was trembling, but her eyes were sharp, burning with life. "You hit one," she said. "Maybe," he answered. "Maybe he'll think twice before riding again." She looked toward the canyon mouth. "He won't think twice. Men like that never do." He sat back against the rock, exhaustion pressing heavy on his shoulders. "Then we'll have to finish this before he does." The night stretched long and cold. They spoke little, but both felt the same truth crawling under their skin. The fight wasn't over. The man in the vest wasn't some stray outlaw. He was part of something larger, something that bled through every ranch, every well, every patch of dry land. Men like him didn't just steal, they built power on the bones of others. By dawn, Naira's fever had risen again. Her face was pale, her body weak, but her eyes stayed open. He found a small spring hidden under the ledge, cold and clear, and brought her water. She drank slowly, her voice faint. "If you go back to your ranch, they will burn it. They will take your cattle, your land, everything." "I know," he said, tying the canteen to his belt. "But I can't keep running either." "There is one way," she said. "If we reach the old mission by the river, I can show proof. My people buried what they found, papers, a map, things they took from the wagon. The mission walls still stand. If the law will not listen to words, they might listen to what is written." He thought about it. The mission lay 50 miles south, across hard country, and through open plains where there was no place to hide. But if she was right, if the papers showed what those men were doing, it might be the only way to break their hold. "Then that's where we're going," he said. "But we'll need help." Naira's gaze steadied on him. "The boy," she whispered. "The one from the ridge. He said he knows the trails." The rancher nodded. Finch had the look of someone who'd seen too much of the world's rough edges. If anyone could find a back way to the river, it was him. He saddled the mare again, helped Naira up, and turned west toward the basin. The sun rose behind them, blood-red on the horizon. By midday, the heat returned. Waves of it shimmered across the plains. They followed the dry wash, every step leaving dust swirling behind. When they reached the low hills where Finch had first found them, the boy appeared like a coyote, quiet, wary, and grinning through dirt and sweat. "Told you those riders were bad news," he said. "Saw them again this morning, headed toward your ranch. Looked like they had a dozen men now." The rancher's jaw tightened. "Then we ride faster," Finch nodded. "I know a path through Red Hollow. It's rough, but it'll keep us out of sight." Climbed onto his pony and led them down a trail that wound through narrow clefts and broken stone. The ground dropped steeply, and the air grew cooler. But in that quiet, every sound echoed loud, the scrape of hooves, the creak of leather, the beat of their hearts. That evening, they reached the rim above the valley. Far below, the desert spread wide and still, but in the distance, smoke curled thin against the setting sun. The rancher stared, fists clenching around the reins. It was coming from his land. "They found it," he said. Naira's voice was soft, but steady. "They burn what they cannot own." He didn't move for a long time. The smoke rose higher, turning the sky gray. Memories flooded him, the corral he built by hand, the carved post his wife once painted, the quiet mornings when the land still felt honest. It was gone now, taken like everything else these men touched. He turned his face away from the valley. Then we finish this. No more running." They rode through the night, the stars sharp and clear above them. Finch guided the way, cutting across gullies and old trails that twisted like scars in the earth. The rancher stayed silent, his mind fixed on the mission, on the papers Naira said would prove everything. Each mile felt heavier, as if the land itself was testing their will. At dawn, they reached the edge of the river plain. Mist hung low over the water. The ruins of the old mission stood in the distance. A skeleton of stone walls and a broken bell tower leaning against the morning light. Birds flew out from the rafters as they approached, their cries sharp in the still air. Inside the mission, the air smelled of dust and damp. Naira walked ahead, limping but sure, her hand brushing the cracked walls. "Here," she said, kneeling near the altar. She pushed aside loose stones, and from beneath them, she drew a small leather pouch, worn and stiff with age. Inside were folded pages, yellow and brittle, covered in inked marks and lines. A map, a ledger, names and figures written in a careful hand. The rancher studied it under the weak light. The words matched her story lists of wells, payments, and land plots tied to the banker's name. Signatures, dates, and the proof of a stolen empire. "This is enough," he said. "With this, even the marshal will have to listen." But Naira shook her head. "The marshal takes coin from them. You must show it to the papers, to the traders, to the people. If they know, they will fight." Before he could answer, Finch hissed sharply. From outside came the faint clatter of hooves, then the creak of leather. The rancher moved to the doorway, rifle ready. Through the haze of dawn, he saw the vested man again alive, though his sleeve was torn and dark with dried blood. He sat tall in the saddle, eyes colder than the steel at his hip. Behind him, more riders spread out across the plain. "End of the trail," the man called out. "You think you can bury the truth, same as she did? You think anyone cares who owns a spring or a piece of paper?" His laughter rolled like thunder. "This land belongs to whoever can take it." The rancher stepped out, shoulders squared, the rifle steady in his hands. Finch crouched behind a wall, eyes wide but ready. Naira clutched the leather pouch to her chest, her face set with fierce calm. The man in the vest raised his hand. "Last chance," he said. "Hand her over, and I might let you crawl out of this canyon alive." The wind picked up, carrying the smell of dust and smoke from the plains. The rancher's voice was quiet but steady. "You've taken enough." The man smiled slowly. "Then I'll take the rest." A shot rang out. The sound tore through the morning silence, and the fight began. Dust exploded from the ground, the mission walls echoing with the crack of rifles. The mare screamed and reared, the air thick with gunpowder and smoke. Finch darted through the shadows, pulling Naira toward the altar. The rancher fired again, the bullet striking a rock inches from the vested man's boot. He ducked, returned fire, and the sound of chaos filled the air. The battle swirled through the ruins like wildfire. Stone shattered, lead hissed through air, and in the rising sun, the mission turned into a trap of smoke and fury. The rancher knew there was no way out now, without a cost. But somewhere in that dust, hope burned fierce, the kind that couldn't be bought or buried. And as the gunfire roared, the story of truth and vengeance reached its breaking point. Waiting for the moment when fate would finally choose its side. The mission's stone walls echoed with the sound of battle. The morning sun climbed higher, spilling light across the crumbling arches where dust and smoke tangled in the air. The rancher crouched behind a pillar, breathing hard, his rifle hot from firing. Across the courtyard, the man in the vest was shouting orders to his men, his voice full of fury. Bullets struck the old altar, scattering fragments of plaster. But Naira and Finch stayed low behind it, the precious papers clutched tight in her hands. Every heartbeat felt louder than the gunfire. The rancher leaned around the pillar and fired again. One of the riders fell, his rifle slipping from his hand. Another ducked behind a wall, reloading fast. Finch was crawling through the rubble, trying to reach a better angle, while Naira tore a strip of her dress and tied it around his bleeding arm where a bullet had grazed him. The smell of gunpowder burned their lungs, and every sound felt sharp, like the land itself was holding its breath. The man in the vest stepped forward into the sunlight, revolver steady, his voice calm despite the chaos. "You can't win this, cowboy," he called out. "You've lost your ranch, your land, and soon your life. Hand over what doesn't belong to you. Nobody will remember a dead drifter." The rancher wiped the sweat from his brow, his jaw tightening. "Maybe they won't remember me," he said, "but they'll remember what you did." He fired again, the bullet catching the edge of the vest man's shoulder. The outlaw stumbled back, rage flashing across his face. "You'll die for that," he hissed. "Every drop of your sweat will mean nothing." The sound of hooves came from the distance, then faint but clear. The rancher's eyes narrowed. Finch looked up too. "Someone's coming," he whispered. The outlaws hesitated, glancing toward the open plain. Dust was rising fast, and the faint glint of metal moved through it. For a heartbeat, everyone froze. Then a voice cut through the wind. "Marshall's riders. Hold your fire." The rancher couldn't believe it at first. The marshal was known to keep close to the town's banker, the same man tied to these outlaws. But the sight of the star glinting on the lead rider's chest was unmistakable. The men in the vest's crew panicked. A few turned to flee, others shouted to cover their retreat. The man in the vest snarled and grabbed his rifle, shouting, "Don't stop! The law works for me." But it was too late. The new riders stormed the field, gunfire cracking through the dust. Two of the outlaws dropped their weapons. Another was thrown from his horse. The marshal himself rode straight for the mission. Eyes locked on the chaos unfolding inside, the rancher stood from cover, rifle aimed but not firing. The marshal dismounted, shouting for everyone to hold. "Drop your weapons," he commanded. The man in the vest didn't move. His revolver hung loose at his side, his eyes burning with hatred. "You think you can arrest me?" he spat. "Half the land you ride on belongs to me." The marshal's face was stone. "Not after this morning, it doesn't." He gestured to Naira, who held the bundle of papers in trembling hands. "Those papers tell a story you can't buy your way out of." For the first time, the man in the vest faltered. His confidence cracked, his voice lowering to a desperate growl. "You don't know what you're doing," he said. "You destroy me. You destroy every rancher in this valley." "I kept them alive. You kept them starving," the rancher said. "And now the land will speak for itself." The man lunged for his gun, but the marshal fired first. The shot echoed across the mission, like thunder rolling through the desert. The outlaw fell backward, dust rising around him, his revolver slipping from his grasp. Silence followed, broken only by the wind moving through the empty walls. Finch lowered his head, breathing hard. Naira stood still, her eyes closed as if she were listening to the quiet. The rancher's hands trembled slightly as he lowered his rifle. It was over, but the weight of it all hung heavy in the air. The marshal walked toward them, his expression unreadable. "You two have made quite a storm," he said. "Half the town will talk about this before sundown." He took the papers from Naira, scanning them quickly. "These are enough to hang the banker and his men twice over. You've done this valley a service, though it'll take time for the land to heal." He looked at the rancher then, his tone softening. "I heard about your ranch." "I'm sorry." The rancher nodded quietly. "Wasn't much left to save. But I reckon there's still land enough to rebuild." The marshal tipped his hat. "We'll ride back to town. You'll both be safe now. Folks will want to hear the truth from you." By the time the riders left, the sun was high and hot. The rancher stood in the shadow of the old mission, looking over the plain. The mare grazed quietly near the spring, her sides streaked with dust. Finch sat near the steps, wrapping his arm again. "You think they'll really listen in town?" he asked. "They'll have to," the rancher said. "Once a lie's written down, it can be burned. But once the truth is spoken, it stays." Naira walked to the edge of the courtyard, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "My people will return to the valley now," she said softly. "We'll rebuild our camps near the river. The land remembers who cares for it." She turned to him, her face calm, but full of meaning. "You've done more than save me." You've saved a piece of this land that would have been lost forever. He looked at her, the wind tugging at the loose strands of her dark hair. We both did, he said. Some things you can't fight alone. Days later, the town buzzed with the story. The marshal posted the papers on the courthouse wall for all to see. The banker and his partners were taken into custody, their influence crumbling like dry clay. Ranchers who had nearly lost everything came forward, their voices united for the first time. For once, justice seemed to belong to those who had worked the soil, not those who had bought it. The rancher returned to his land weeks later. The ashes of his home still marked the ground, but the fences stood strong. The cattle that had scattered began to wander back from the hills. He rebuilt slow and steady, plank by plank, letting the rhythm of honest work mend what violence had torn apart. Finch came by often to help, and sometimes he brought word of the townsfolk or news from the valley. One evening, as the sun burned low and the air turned golden, Naira rode up the trail. Her leg had healed, though she still carried a faint limp. She dismounted and stood beside the corral, looking out over the land. The springs are safe now, she said. The map was burned in the courthouse yard. My people are planting near the river again. He smiled faintly. And you? I'll stay near the hills, she said. Watch over the land. Maybe teach the children what this place cost. She turned to him, her eyes warm but distant. And you, will you stay? He looked at the open fields, the rebuilt fence lines stretching under the setting sun. A man's roots don't always grow where he plants them, he said. But I reckon this is where mine belong. They stood together in quiet, watching the sky fade into fire. A hawk wheeled high above, its shadow crossing the ground like a promise. The world felt bigger than before, but also gentler, as if the land itself had taken a deep breath after a long silence. When she rode away, he didn't call after her. He knew she carried something that no one could take, a spirit born of the earth and the wind. And she left behind something in him too, a reminder that kindness and courage were still worth holding on to. Even when the world tried to take them away, weeks turned to months, and the valley slowly came alive again. The wells ran clean, the grass returned. Travelers spoke of the woman who once defied death, and the rancher who stood beside her when no one else would. The mission ruins became a place where people came to remember, a quiet mark of how truth had survived in the dust. One evening, as the sky burned red over the plains, the rancher leaned on his fence and looked toward the hills. He could almost see her silhouette there, riding against the sunset, as the wind carried her name softly through the grass. He smiled, feeling the peace that had been missing for so long. Out on that vast land, where every sound seemed to echo forever, he finally understood what it meant to belong not to a place, but to a promise kept. And as the last light faded from the sky, he tipped his hat to the horizon and whispered a simple truth that had carried him through it all. The land remembers,